Keir Starmer might not be the Prime Minister for much longer. Over the course of the last 48 hours, many MPs have asked that he step aside. Although even more MPs, for now, have asked the man to stay. But whether he goes this week, after a Labour conference in September, or at Christmas, it doesn't really matter. Because if he is still the Prime Minister by the time of next year's local elections in May 2027, the previously unthinkable could happen. Labour will lose Liverpool. If that happens, then people stop saying whether the party can win double-digit MPs and, in all seriousness, start talking about single digits. And that conclusion of the Labour Party winning single-digit MPs is not me making evidence-free predictions. Polling done by YouGov and published today gives Reform an 11-point lead over the Tories and the Greens, with Labour down 2 points in the aftermath of those local elections. That data was projected by Stats for Lefties into this outcome, with Labour winning 20 seats, which isn't that hard to believe when you think the Greens won the popular vote in places like Newcastle and Birmingham, and Reform, of course, romped home in towns and suburbs. What this all means is that Starmer could be Labour's shortest-serving Prime Minister ever, something which perhaps shouldn't be a surprise, because if he doesn't last until the next general election, he will be the fifth MP to not see out a full term. Extraordinary, but there you go. Something deeper is clearly going on in British politics. But back to Labour and the party's history in government. As of today, Keir Starmer has been in number 10 for 1 year and 310 days. And while he has outlasted Rishi Sunak, Anthony Eden, Alec Douglas-Home, and of course, the lettuce, Liz Truss, he needs to stick around for another year and 9 days to outlast Gordon Brown. He, of course, was in the job for 2 years and 318 days. Of course, in terms of a single ministry, Starmer has already beaten Ramsay MacDonald. He was Labour's first ever PM. He lasted just 287 days in 1929. A little event happened, you might have heard of it, the Great Depression. A bit of a spanner in the works, it's fair to say. MacDonald did, however, come back and last for 6 years, the second time of asking. Gordon Brown and Ramsay MacDonald mark one, not to mention Rishi Sunak. It's hardly august company for a man who won a larger majority than Margaret Thatcher ever achieved less than 2 years ago. I'm going to repeat that. In 2024, Keir Starmer won a bigger majority than Thatcher in 79, 83 or 87. Michael, what the hell happened and how much of that was self-inflicted?
I mean, we've been talking a lot on the show about sort of the structural reasons why it is difficult to govern at the moment. I mean, with Keir Starmer, a hell of a lot of it was self-inflicted. I mean, I suppose the biggest mistake he potentially made was, one, going into government without any plan, but two, going into government without any real allies.
Right.
Because the whole project was just so unpleasant to everyone that there wasn't anyone willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, obviously, the thing that everyone seems to remember on the doorstep, sort of when you sort of read what the pollsters are saying or in their focus groups, it's all about the winter fuel payment. Now, the winter fuel payment cut, to my mind, wasn't the most outrageous policy in the world. Like, I'm not necessarily in favor of cutting it, but this whole idea that sort of this was murdering old people. I mean, it was a universal £300 that was instituted sort of 15 years ago for a demographic which is sort of more comfortable than other demographics. Like, probably they should have means tested it sort of to a larger number of people than they did. What I'm saying is that there were some slight problems with the policy, but it became this monumental issue, partly because everyone was just waiting for an issue to attack Keir Starmer on, because everyone had a grudge against him. And the reason everyone had a grudge against him is because he hadn't built up any goodwill, because their whole policy going into that election, sort of into the general election, was this sort of arrogant, we don't need anyone else, we're doing this our way, so F you. And if that's going to be your approach, you better well have an idea and an argument you can make, because you can be a divisive person. Like, Nigel Farage is a divisive person. I hope he doesn't win the next general election, but you know, it hasn't completely crushed his popularity, because he can stand out there and make an aggressive argument. They don't like me because, you know, I believe in this change that we need, yada, yada, yada. Keir Starmer, if you're not the kind of person who is decisive and has ideas, you need people on side, and they did the opposite.
They tried to make their coalition as small as possible. You know, the whole idea of wedge issues is that you get the majority of the public, not the minority of the public. Michael, I'm going to come back to you on this because it's a really interesting story. And of course, you have a lot of interesting things to say. I do, however, have a guess lined up for you. It's worth saying the extent of Starmer's unpopularity has been a matter of public record for some time. As far back as January, this is a crazy one. As far back as January, YouGov had Starmer's net favourability on a par with Liz Truss, which was the equal lowest ever. So we can joke about Liz Truss, but Keir Starmer's there as well. And after winning, like I say, a bigger majority than Thatcher ever achieved. Quite extraordinary. I'm now joined by Paul Holden. Paul is an investigative journalist, friend of the show, and of course, author of The Fraud, which is about Keir Starmer, Labour together, and the crisis of British democracy. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
If people aren't aware of Paul's fantastic work, they should, of course, buy that book and watch the interview he did with us here at Novara Media on Downstream with Ash. Paul, my first question really is somebody who's really, perhaps you're better acquainted with the Labour Together kind of faction than anyone else in British media. Can Starmer last? And clearly there are lots of powerful people who've been very invested in this project with Morgan McSweeney and Peter Mandelson, etc. It would be naive to think they just disappear. So can Starmer last? And then where do these people go?
Well, I think Starmer absolutely can't last. I think that's very clear. I think these election results are terminal for him. Realistically speaking, he probably shouldn't have lasted this long anyway. And it's a sense of the effectiveness of this political project to effectively erase anything of competence or value in the Labour Party that was a threat to their particular faction that has kept him in power this long. Because really, in normal circumstances, the crisis around Peter Mandelson was so profound and so severe and so damaging that in normal circumstances, if you had a cabinet of big beasts, of people who could mobilise the constituency, he probably would have been taken down at that point. And it seems very plain speaking to a huge number of MPs that they all pretty much understand very clearly that if Keir Starmer leads the Labour Party into the next election, they'll all lose their jobs. Keir Starmer's personal polling is utterly dire. The Labour Party's polling is not great, but this is a situation which is actually quite unusual where the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister is more unpopular than his party. And in that sort of situation, the party's going to make a calculation about who steps forward. Now, the problem that they have is that this was a very narrowly constructed political project. It was Morgan McSweeney and a small handful of people who were choosing this new intake of MPs who were not chosen for any particular reason of charisma or the strength of their ideas, their ability to appeal to the public. In fact, in a vast number of cases, they weren't even really put to the public as they were parachuted in at the last minute ahead of an election they were going to win anyway. And in that sort of situation, those people are more loyal to Morgan McSweeney and more loyal to this project than they are to Keir Starmer personally. This has never really been Keir Starmer's party, even when he was leader. So there is going to be a move on him at some point. The problem is the Labour Party is so denuded of talent and also denuded of bravery that they have to confect this mad situation where they have to bring in somebody from outside of government effectively to try and right the ship. It is just a matter of time. How much damage and how messy it is getting to that point. It's very hard to see how this doesn't become a really ugly bun fight over the next weeks and months.
We had a great comment in our chat a moment ago. Paul Holden must be one of the most vindicated people in history. There you go. Paul Holden must feel so vindicated. The guy wrote a book and then, a year later it all blows up. Important journalism, it turns out. It doesn't come for free. I just wanted to go back to the Labour Together question, though, because some really powerful economic interests were invested in that. Lots of money by British standards went towards the Labour Together project and to Keir Starmer. These people aren't just going to give up in terms of looking at the Labour Party as a vehicle for what they want, surely? Or is this now a completely busted flush in terms of Labour Together and their role in the Labour Party and the wider ecology of organisations around the Labour Party?
It's very hard to tell. Labour Together is an odd organisation and it always has been an odd organisation. Up until 2023, it didn't really exist except as a vehicle for Morgan McSweeney's bizarre secret projects that he ran for many years, and then as the incubator for Keir Starmer's election campaign, but effectively went dormant between 2021 and 2023. And then it only sort of got money back in because they understood that at that point, Liz Truss had been so unpopular that there was guaranteed that there was going to be a Labour victory. So all the people who had backed Morgan McSweeney's campaign and Keir Starmer's campaign, they started pouring money into Labour Together as a means of sort of rapidly on the fly trying to develop a policy network and a policy proposal that would guide the Labour Party into government. And really their influence and their success was predicated almost exclusively on the idea that Keir Starmer would lead a government of Blairite competence and unity for the next 5 to 10 years, in which these people who are investing money in Labour Together can see a return on their investment. I mean, at this point in time, Labour Together itself as a brand is I think, very significantly tainted by its association with Morgan McSweeney, with Keir Starmer, obviously with the scandal that centered around their going after journalists like myself and reporting us to security services and smearing us with mad allegations. To the extent that Labour Together are actually now looking to totally rebrand, there's a talk about they might even change their name altogether. They're no longer going to be supporting particular MPs. They're going to focus specifically on policy. But if Andy Burnham wins, if Andy Burnham is somehow the manufacturer situation where Andy Burnham comes back into cabinet or back into parliament, then becomes leader. I mean, Labour Together has no avenue to exercise influence over the Labour Party anymore. It dissipates altogether. And at that point, you have to think, well, why would these people carry on backing this particular vehicle? That doesn't mean they won't create new vehicles. There won't be new pressure points. There won't be new ways to try and lobby a new Burnham leadership. But I think this architecture that was set up in anticipation of like a 10-year glorious reign of centrist technocratic managerial competence where they could write policies like digital ID, that's out the water. That's not happening anymore. And these people who want to achieve these things will have to go elsewhere to do so, I think.
So imagine Andy Burnham becomes the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister. He's saying, look, I'm going to hold maybe a general election a year, 18 months, which I think would be a reasonable thing to say. You know, I want to get one parliament through of legislation, then we'll go back to the country. And he says, Paul, he calls you, you know, he leaves a WhatsApp voice note. Paul, I read the fraud. It's fantastic. These people are awful. What happened to you is terrible. Let's say he doesn't even mean it. You know, he's doing the politician thing. He's trying to build a coalition. And he says, what should I do with these people? Should they be thrown out of the Labour Party? What should I do with them? Should I purge them? What would your recommendation be?
I mean, that's a really interesting question because really what that question, I think, is the question I've been having with lots of different people. So how do you, is there a path to renew the Labour Party after this project? You know, I think what I tried to explain in the fraud and what I've been trying to alert people to is that this was a project that wasn't sort of temporary. This project sits outside of Labour history in a sense because it is the most radical, systematic transformation of the Labour Party in its history. And they were briefing this. They were saying, we are changing the DNA of the party. And they were radically effective at doing it. You know, they took over the bureaucracy. They ran it entirely within their control. They handpicked 260 MPs who make up the rump of parliament. They handpicked councillors. They purged the bureaucracy. They got rid of half the membership. This is not the same Labour Party as has existed probably in the last 40 to 50 years, right? And I don't know whether there is a path to a restoration of the Labour Party or a rejuvenation of the Labour Party. It seems to me that the very obvious thing that you need to be doing at this point, you know, if I was to give some policy advice to the Labour Party, is two things. One is you have to have an independent forensic auditor and examination and a committee and maybe even a select committee inquiry into Labour Together, but also into all the historic shenanigans that have happened in the Labour Party, like Ergen House, which I write about in the book. And you need to just absolutely clear house on that basis. And I do honestly think that if you were to do an outside and external forensic audit of Labour Party finances, quite a few people would have to leave the party as a result. And the second thing is you'd have to bring in radical democratic transformation of the Labour Party at grassroots. And for me, the simplest thing that Andy Burnham could do to win over the membership, but also to create a new cadre of potential MPs who could actually appeal to the country, is to say we will no longer we will have mandatory reselection for MPs. They will have to be voted on by their branches. We're not going to do, stitch-ups or anything like that. We're going to actually listen to the wisdom of our branches. Because I think the thing that's really interesting, if you look at these local elections, is the extent to which, there's all sorts of reasons why this Labour project has failed and why they did so badly in the local election. But one of which is that all the MPs that they've put into these constituencies have almost no substantive long-term history of community organizing, of being in the community, of being in the Labour Party even. In some cases, people like Alex Barras-Curtis, who was given a role as the MP in Cardiff West, haven't even won a single internal Labour Party election before they've been made an MP candidate, right? That's a total lack of a local constituency. And what it means is that when the leadership is unpopular, they can't even rely on local MPs to have their own network of local support to go out and rally the troops and say, well, actually, I'm worth defending. The Labour project is worth defending. And the only way you can really do that is to basically say to the membership, you know what, we're going back to the drawing board. We're going to do a grassroots-based Labour Party where we choose MPs from the bottom up. We're going to listen to you. And maybe in that process, first of all, you might encourage some people who've left the Labour Party and gone to the Greens to come back to the Labour Party because they see it as a vehicle for actual change in democracy. And second of all, you're far more likely through that process to get candidates who actually relate to the local community and have charisma and the policy ideas than this mad thing of three people, including Luke Akehurst and Morgan McSweeney, looking at, the collected CVs of a bunch of briefcase people from the third sector and then parachuting him into seats. I think that would be the thing I would suggest to him.
I wanted to ask a question, actually, Paul, because I know you've sort of very forensically documented the extent to which the Labour Together gang sort of moulded the party in their image. We've all seen sort of how brutally they excluded talented left-wing parliamentary candidates like Faiza Shaheen. Of that, there is no doubt. At the same time, I do think that sort of recent events potentially suggest that their revolution wasn't as complete as they might have believed it to be. I'm looking at tweets now, sort of people suggesting maybe Wes Streeting doesn't even have the numbers to get a leadership nomination, and he's definitely not going to win the membership. The centre of gravity in the party seems to be more Ed Miliband than Wes Streeting. And so I wonder if you think that the Labour Together gang might be a bit disappointed, and if actually the Labour Party is still much more soft left than Morgan McSweeney. You can think about the rebellions on the welfare bill, for example. To me, it doesn't seem like actually the Labour Party is now full of dyed-in-the-wall sort of Liz Kendallites.
No, and I think that's always been the tension of this project, right? It's always been the tension of the Labour Party, in a sense, which is that the membership of the party and its social base is left-wing. It's soft left or it's left wing. And generally speaking, its MP, its PLP segment of the Labour Party has been more right wing than the membership. And that's been a real problem for a long time. And what the Labour Together project is actually, I think it's a very clear-eyed project in the sense that these people who prosecuted it understood at a very deep and fundamental level that they themselves don't have a constituency in the party of any size, that they themselves and their own personalities, but also their factual modus operandi, but also their policy proposals are not popular with the Labour Party membership at all. So this is why they have to engage in skullduggery, in dishonesty, misdirection, stitch-ups, because they understand that if there is a healthy, vibrant democracy, these people stand no chance of being elected as MPs or onto the NEC or have the power that they do. So that tension's always going to be there. In a sense, there were limits to how they could transform the party because, to transform the party into an image that matches McSweeney's politics, really what you need to do is basically kick out 95% of the membership. And I don't pull that figure out of nowhere because obviously we know that the thing that McSweeney ran before Keir Starmer's campaign was Liz Kendall's campaign, and she got 4.5% of the membership voting for her. That's actually the level of membership support for this sort of politics, right? So this has always been the issue. So when I write about the Labour Together project and the McSweeney project and the Starmer project, this has really been a project of dishonesty in order to bureaucratically capture a machine, a parliamentary machine, to procure themselves power and all sorts of other things that they're looking to do, but which is fundamentally unstable because it requires an authoritarian approach to its own membership. It requires stitching up democracy. And I think what we've seen, there's this very important document I write about in the book called Redshift, which is a policy document published by Labour Together in 2023. And basically what it does is it sets up the path for the Labour Party to win the next general election. And I'm not going to go into detail, but what they essentially do is they segment the voting population of the UK into 6 segments. And they identify two segments on the left, which is basically people like you, like what they would call the activist left, and then centrist ads. And they say these people are not relevant to this election. We can ignore them. In fact, in certain times, it makes sense for us to actively antagonize them, because that's the way we can prove to the other voting segments that we have their interests at heart. It's what I think is behind the ritualistic humiliation of people like Diane Abbott and Faiza Shaheen. There's a political logic to something like that. And what they sort of arrogantly didn't anticipate is that there is a limit to the amount of abuse people will take in a political party before they go somewhere else. And I think, I was speaking to a CW Fringe event this past week, and I was trying to explain to people that people leaving the Labour Party and joining another political party or deciding to vote for another political party is not an easy or simple thing to do. It often is quite an emotional thing for people to do, because they've had long-term 40, 30, 10, 20 years associations with the political project. But one of the things that's happened as a result of this, because of the instability of it, because of the authoritarianism of it, because they don't actually have a base in the party which they can turn to the membership and say, support us, they've driven people out. They've driven people to other political formations. So there was always an instability at the heart of it. It's an impossibility, really, at a fundamental level, to turn a membership organization that's left-wing into a membership organization that looks like Reform with the Tories. You can only do that through bureaucratic control. And this is the contradiction that is now playing out, I think, in that the contradiction is resolving itself by people just leaving it and going somewhere else.
That's really, really useful stuff. Paul, thanks for joining us this evening.
Sure. Thank you so much.
That was Paul Holden, author of The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Labour Together, and the Crisis of British Democracy. I've got a few thoughts about what he was just saying there a moment ago. I mean, one is, and it's easy to forget, the centre of the Labour Party membership is still very left-wing. I know people that voted for Starmer, voted for Burnham, the first time round. They weren't voting for the left candidates, but they're incensed that Palestine Action, for instance, has been prescribed. I know one person who said, I will leave the party if they ban these marches, right? And that's not somebody who is a Jeremy Corbyn supporter even. And it seems to me that, as Paul was kind of saying there, that this very small coterie of people weren't just at odds with the coded left of the party that voted for Corbyn, were in momentum, etc. But actually, I think 95% I think is actually probably quite accurate, at least 90%. Secondly, and I think this is a few sort of points worth mentioning in terms of pragmatism. We hear this term political pragmatism all the time. And of course, the left aren't pragmatic, the right are pragmatic. The reason why you want a left in the Labour Party, even if you're on the right of the party, is twofold in my book. Firstly, if you had a left in the party, Mandelson never happens, because you have other people in the tent and they say, look, we don't think this is wise, actually. Here's why, 1, 2, 3. It's not everybody is best pals to the guy and thinks it's a really smart idea. Secondly, in a crisis, you have shock absorbers. You have a very wide range of support and, you don't just sort of collapse, which is what's happening with Starmer. So you want a broad tent, and that's not a left thing or a right thing. You don't want people who disagree with you. Right? I don't think the left should say, we want Labour together on the Labour Party. No, they're spoilers, they're wreckers, get them out. But you do want a broad tent in terms of being able to, at least with first past the post, go to the public and actually be a resilient organisation. Michael, quickly, I've got a few other questions before we wrap up tonight. For me, and again, just to be clear, I'm not a Labour member. I wouldn't vote Labour at the next general election, I don't think, because it's a Lib Dem Labour margin. I have that luxury. I'd like the Greens to do quite well. But for me, and I don't think Burnham's perfect, there are problems with him. But if he said, I back PR, I back mandatory selection, and I believe in a coalitional politics to stop reactionary politics, to stop the radical right, I would think that's a really good basis on which he could project political authority and actually have quite a popular political programme. What do you think? Again, I said to Paul, you've got Andy Burnham leaves a voice note. Andy Burnham gets in touch with Michael Walker, says, Michael, I know you don't think I'm perfect. 2 or 3 things I can do to make me popular both with the members but also with the public at large.
I think it's very unlikely he's going to go for mandatory selection. I think something...
If he has to win a leadership election, he might have to do that, right?
If he Well, he's not going to have to offer that to who would he have to offer that?
If he did, if there was another candidate that went up against him, he might say, well, actually, I need to offer this. Or maybe not mandatory selection, but something else which is democratic within the party.
I mean, you could have something like that. I mean, I think what's kind of interesting in this moment is, in a way, how flimsy the Labour Together project was. I mean, people said this when Corbyn was leader. They're like, he has transformed the Labour Party and it's never going to be the same again. The whole infrastructure of Corbynism crumbled within about 2 months after Keir Starmer was elected leader. And I do think it is very possible that the moment, I mean, it almost happened the moment Morgan McSweeney left Downing Street, that the Labour Together infrastructure is collapsing and the Labour Party is going to become a kind of soft left managerial organisation again, right? Which is what it looks like it's going to become. Now, you know, whether that can win election after election, I've got no idea. I'm always a little bit skeptical of the idea that we need sort of community organisers from these sort of various constituencies. I think we kind of need some people who are very talented policymakers to make some decent policy because this country desperately needs it. I mean,
but why is that at odds with mandatory selection? No, look at, for instance, Faiza Shaheen. She would have been the MP for Chingford. She's a very, astute policy person. It wasn't like the members wanted some, muppet instead of her.
Well, I think you can pick some good candidates. I mean, I think it will bring up some good candidates. I think it might bring up some not so good candidates. I mean, I wouldn't have that as a priority right now. I was very much in favour of it when sort of Corbyn was leader because it was impossible to have.
But hold on. This is really important, right? They have primaries in the US.
Yeah.
And the Democrats, out of the primary system, get Mamdani, AOC, a ton of really talented people. And I think you're buying into this binary that is, if you allow the public to decide candidates, you get inferior candidates. I just don't see any evidence for that.
If you want to have it as primaries, yes. If you want to have it as the Labour membership, that's different.
So you support primaries instead of...
I support primaries instead of mandatory selection, I think, basically. But in any case, I mean, I think we do need a lot of very talented, competent people who can implement a reform agenda, which is going to bring sort of growth to the UK. I think Andy Burnham is well placed to do that. I think he's got a lot of very interesting people around him, actually. I mean, Ed Miliband probably will go into number 11 if Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister. And we will have a very interesting agenda of sort of bringing some things back into public ownership. I hope they sort of continue with planning reform, make it cheaper and easier to build stuff. I would get rid of some of the judicial review when it comes to building state infrastructure. I think you want people to see stuff getting built really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And you want a compelling story which you can tell. I would like to see, Andy Burnham week after week standing in front of a new thing getting built, like some council housing, some new housing that isn't council housing, a big, train station. The moment he gets in, he should announce that HS2 is going to go all the way to Manchester, and it is going to go all the way to Leeds, and it is going to go all the way to Scotland, and that they're going to immediately work out why it costs so much money, get rid of all the judicial reviews that meant it took so long. I think you want him to get in there and very quickly start doing stuff. To be honest, I would also, because he's going to be very constrained financially, so it probably will take a while to see some of these benefits. And there are lots of people who see sort of Israel-Palestine as sort of like a left obsession. There's another way of looking at it, from a very opportunistic, cynical lens, which is that is a really cheap way to show that you are not the same as the previous guy. You literally don't lose any voters in this country by taking a really tough line against Benjamin Netanyahu.
100%.
If Andy Burnham comes in and says, I'm inspired by, meets up with Pedro Sanchez and talks about how he is going to make sure that Britain is finally going to hold Benjamin Netanyahu to account, that immediately wins back so many Green voters, brings back so many people to the party who had abandoned it, doesn't cost him a penny. The bond markets are not going to care. And that will give him the time and... But by the way, it's morally the correct thing to do for the Palestinians. But also, if we're talking about the challenge which is going to face the next Labour leader, that might give him the time and space that he can come up with an economic plan that can win sort of the confidence of broad constituencies and finally ultimately improve living standards in the country.
Also, with the Reform voters, there are so many things that you can do which literally cost nothing. Give a speech. I know some people don't like my sort of Twitter posts, my ex posts showing, bombed out buildings from World War II and they were rebuilt and they were awful. He should give a speech saying about how bad post-war planning was. Say it was disaster. Talk about how great Victorian architecture was. I know it sounds daft, but that's the mood music where actually a Reform voter in, bits of, I don't know, the Northeast goes, he's right. What they did to Newcastle was awful. where I am in Portsmouth, the Royal Garrison Church, they never put the roof back on it. English Heritage administers this building. He should be standing outside a building. And you might say, well, no, he needs to build, new schools and hospitals, all of that as well. Just 2 or 3 buildings. So we're going to build it. Nobody's built this since 1945. The Luftwaffe destroyed it in 1941. We're going to rebuild it while I'm Prime Minister. That costs barely a couple of £1 million. And it's just so striking that politicians like Keir Starmer are completely incapable of doing this stuff. And I think it's because, I don't know why, my hunch is that they're just so locked out from the country outside the M25. I say the M25, I really mean SW1, actually, I have to be quite frank. And that's not just politicians, that's their allies in the media as well. Michael, we've almost finished our show tonight. We've got almost 4,000 of you watching. Just to say, again, today we launched our fabulous fundraiser. We're looking to add 2,000 new supporters. We're going to be moving into an extraordinary new studio later this summer. For you, Michael, what does having that bigger studio mean? How will it change our work here at Novara Media?
One, the whole team will be sort of in the same building. So sort of video, articles, everyone will be able to sort of communicate a little bit more. At the moment, we're sort of all dotted around this industrial estate, which improvements could be made there. So I think we'll be a more coherent organization, we'll be more central. I'm just really looking forward to getting more people in the building for debates. I want to talk about, as I said earlier, like the policies that are going to make life in Britain better for people, because I think we're going around in circles in politics and it's actually taking us to quite a dark place. So I kind of want to be part of the solution. And I think that a few more resources, a nicer location, an ability where you can sort of bring in people for a conversation and the chairs aren't falling over, which ours currently are, will really actually make a big difference. Which means, please guys, go to novaramedia.com/support and set up a direct debit. We'll really appreciate it. We should do a thing where sort of if you donate a certain amount, we'll give them an engraving on the side of the studio.
Oh, I quite like that.
I'm not promising that right now, by the way.
Yeah,
but,
Michael is not ahead of fundraising. Yeah. I think Steffi and Alice...
For a reason.
They're doing a cracking job. It will not just allow us to expand, twofold. I think this new studio will allow us to expand 4 or 5 times. And ahead of the next general election in 2029, maybe, could be sooner, we will very much be going toe-to-toe with legacy media. I don't say that lightly. We have, 1.2 million subscribers here on YouTube, nearly 1 million people on Instagram. I think across all those channels, plus YouTube, 4 million. We are really helping to make and shape political discourse in this country. We punch far above our weight. I think once we get these 2,000 new supporters, we can do so much more. Really, really exciting. Really exciting. Because we said 15 years ago, when we started this thing, you cannot change politics without changing the media first. You need a different media for a different politics. And Michael, just to say about your point about having these conversations, these debates, you have to disagree. You have to disagree to get to the truth. Knowledge through doubt. And no less than Joseph Stalin in Pravda, before he went crazy, before all the purges.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the sort of dictum that he lived by, was it?
Well, no, he had a great line, believe it or not. Pravda, until about 1920, the Russian Revolution was quite, intellectually generative and open. But before even the Russian Revolution, Stalin had a line in Pravda, which he edited. He said, the only place that people should disagree is the cemetery. Right?
The only place they shouldn't disagree.
Should disagree. Because people disagree all the time in life, right? When you're dead, of course, you'll disagree because nobody has any opinions. But I think this idea that we shouldn't disagree, I think is silly. And I think it's fabulous that we have all kinds of views here on Novara Media. And Michael and I often disagree. People say, oh my God, they're disagreeing. They must hate each other. I love Michael. He's my fabulous colleague. I learn so much from him.
The more disagreements, the better.
I agree. Well, within reason, right? I mean, if it was just all the time.
If it was relentless yapping.
Yeah. But with that China conversation we had last week, I was saying something, you were saying something, I disagreed. And then I said, it's a good point. You really made me think there. And I value that. And that's what Novara Media is all about. So thanks to Michael for joining me tonight and for joining me here at Novara Media generally. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. And before you go, don't forget to go to novaramedia.com/support. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.